Hey folks, Lemon02 here. Been a while since I've actually put up some content on Magic the Gathering, specifically Canadian Highlander. Before I get started on this deck tech and then gameplay with Naya Aggro / Naya Blitz syntax, this is what I'll call this list. This is kind of a homebrew, which is a straddle build of some more common archetypes in the format. I will advise you to check out the comments section. If you're not interested in deck techs and theory of play for decks, please check out in the comment section. I'll put a timestamp for all of the matches that I'll be showcasing with the deck. That all said, this is Canadian Highlander. It's a 100-card singleton format without sideboards, with a points list to restrict the use of the most powerful cards in the game, such that you can only have certain cards. That said, what we'll be showcasing today is Naya Aggro or Naya Blitz syntaxes, which is essentially a straddle build that tries to encompass as optimally as it can the speed of red-green aggro, losing about 1 to 0.5 turns in the actual clock of that specific deck, while also embracing the best, or ostensibly the best, components of death and taxes, specifically white attack-based creatures that have disruptive effects, i.e. creatures that are counterspells that get your opponent dead, and also ideally have the correct effect or the correct disruptive effect for the matchup that you're currently in. The idea had been that RG Aggro is not the most deeply interactive of decks. It interacts with life total, and that's pretty much it. And it has some capabilities to interact favorably against larger threats with combat tricks. But at the end of the day, though, it's really just a fairly linear, aggressive deck. Whereas Death and Taxes tends to be more of an aggro control strategy that, in my opinion, wins incidentally through its creatures, but generally speaking, actually wins because its creatures have disruptive enough effects that the opponent cannot win in the timetable that your threats present. So the decks kind of operate off of similar but slightly different theories of play, and I thought that I could build a straddle build that encompassed both decks and gave the Death and Taxes deck a faster clock, whilst also keeping the most relevant cards from Death and Taxes to kind of bolster the disruptive effects of red-green Blitz. So what is Blitz, and why would I call this Blitz? When I say this is Naya Blitz pure, no, I don't think it is. The biggest reason that you call a deck Blitz is because you run stuff like Become Immense and Mutagenic Growth and Blossoming Defense, Rancor, Brute Force, basically combat tricks. Berserk is another one that sees play, Gore Clan Rampager, Colossal or Collision Colossus. All these cards are just pump spells. Blitz decks tend to have a decently high creature count, but generally less creatures than most pure aggro builds, whilst embracing the power of combat tricks to act either as burn spells or means of breaking through opposing larger creatures to one, gain card advantage, and also gain virtual advantage by reducing their life total to a point at which they do not have time to enact their plan before you kill them with existing board advantage. That said, the deck does definitely have some Blitz elements to it, but then it has, another pile that I'll go through here, just disruptive cards. Cards that, tend to be very disruptive either in the combat step or in the game plan that the opponent has, that kind of lend the deck to also having some tax effects, that'll buy you a lot of games. Like Thalia Guardian of Thraben, I don't think tends to see play in as many Naya based decks, although I think it possibly could. I mean, maybe in more aggressive builds that do not have a lot of pump spells. Cards like Gaddock Teague, Kasali Pride Mage, Voice of Resurgence. All these threats are not horrendous on their own. They're generally pretty fair or even undercosted for the rate, the power and toughness rate that you get. But what they do kind of allow you to do is also have game against other things. Like Spirit of the Labyrinth is almost essential to winning certain matchups, i.e. like Academy. This stops draw sevens, stops, anything that's going to give your opponent a vast volume of cards, possibly you as well. But those decks tend to be able to produce mana at a far faster rate than is expected for given turn cycle. So oftentimes they can benefit more highly from those style of effects, and you'll see a lot more decks run it, like your Wheel of Fortune type effects. That's kind of where the idea came from, is that, I wanted to still have a good control game plan. I wanted to kind of go over the top of even more linear monochromatic aggro lists. I wanted to have a decent to neutral game plan against most mid-range, probably like a 60-40 matchup, like to my disadvantage with this deck against most mid-range builds, depending on pilot skill and also the variety of mid-range. And then also be really good against combo because I have these extra cards that, I lose about a half turn in my clock because I have less efficient threats, i.e. I'm not playing like Jungle Lions, and stuff like that. or Jackal Pups, which are going to be faster, but I have cards like Spirit of the Labyrinth, which, buy me, generally speaking, more time against those style of decks, or Thalia Heretic Cathar, or Thalia Guardian of Thraben, which, can effectively buy you, 4 to 5 turns, like Thalia Guardian of Thraben, if it throws your opponent off of, a 2 into a 3 into a 4 mana play, and puts them onto a 3 to a 4 to a 5 mana play, you've essentially bought yourself almost 3 turns, because you've taken every single thing that they intended on doing and taken it out of sequence. Now, if they have to interact with your own game plan, with the game plan that you're enacting, that puts them even further behind. So it's just, a lot of these cards can snowball very fast. That's kind of the idea for the straddle build, is that I wanted to take the best cards that have taxing effects and integrate them into a speed aggro deck that, gains most of its advantage just virtually by forcing the game to end before your opponent can do something. Okie doke. So let's break down this deck. This deck is in many piles, and I'll kind of go over that because it is a straddle build and it has a lot of different effects that are kind of interwoven in. And this is really still a relatively rough build. You'll notice that I do not have Wasteland in this deck. I do think Wasteland should go in. And that said, right now I have Mana Confluence here. I think Mana Confluence could get out. We can go to 29 lands plus 4 Moxen, which essentially makes it, kind of like a 34 lander currently. I think we can take Mana Confluence out, though, and actually replace it with Wasteland. Is an added utility land to kind of sit next to Caracas here and be in my utility land spot. The mana base is relatively simple. I have all of the check lands. I have all of the speed lands. I have a Mana Confluence. Speed lands, if you're not tracking, 2 or less, they come into play untapped. I have all of the shock lands that are applicable. All the OG duels, including an additional Bayou. We're not a black deck, but we are running Deathrite Shaman, and right now the ways to activate Deathrite Shaman are off of Bayou and off of Mana Confluence to do damage or to do life loss with it. And then we have, just our 3 basic suite. I think the basics are still useful in this style of deck. Path to Exile is a thing. Assassin's Trophy is a thing. There are a few effects. Even, I can't think of it. Settle the Wreckage is a thing. I want to have the ability to find these sort of lands, and sometimes you play against back to basics, and if you don't have the fastest of starts, they can still be relevant. But the Moxen tend to help out with that as well, and the fact that you're generally going to have onboard advantage before someone can get a back to basics down, i.e., it'll act like a time walk in a lot of cases. Also have the newer Sunbaked Canyon, and Horizon Canopy is cycling lands, canopy lands, whatever they call them, horizons lands, whatever we're calling these now. But they're very good. You don't really generally tend to care as much about the damage you take off these, but the ability to cycle them off in the mid to late game, because we are a little bit more of a landed deck, tends to be nice. One of the things you'll see in the design principles of this deck is that I've straddled a couple different theories in deck building between both Death and Taxes and RG Blitz. We are running more mana sources in this deck than you would in a typical RG Blitz deck. That's twofold. 1, our mana curve's a little higher. 2, we are playing 3 color, which every time you add a color, your raw mana capacity requirements tend to go up because you need more raw capacity to draw more lands to fix for all the cards that you intend on casting. The third piece is, that I think is probably less obvious, is that Death and Taxes is actually generally a fairly well-landed deck, vice the converted mana cost of the cards that you're playing in it. And the reason that tends to happen, at least in this pile, it's my own opinion, is that you tend to want to have a higher land count in Death and Taxes, specifically so that you have the ability to mulligan more aggressively and still acquire curve-out hands that have 2 to 3 lands, or 1 to 2 lands depending on the hand. But you want to be able to aggressively mulligan because so many of your cards range in the different matchups that you want to be using them against. It's an aggro-controlled deck. So in some matchups, the best thing you could be doing is landing a Thalia Guardian of Thraben on turn 2. In some other matchups, it may be Spirit of the Labyrinth, or it could be, Voice of Resurgence, or, turn 3 Thalia Heretic Cathar. Maybe turn 3 Aven Mind Sensor. But these are all kind of effects that, are going to have different relevance in different matchups. So you want to have more raw land capacity so you can mulligan more aggressively to get rid of the irrelevant taxi cards and find the relevant taxi cards. I.e., you want the tax effect on the creatures that you have to be relevant in the matchup you're in. So you're going to mulligan more aggressively, in my opinion, and in my experience with Death and Taxes, than you will with most other aggro decks. I think a lot of folks tend to attribute Death and Taxes as an aggressive deck, and in some ways it is. It's become more so with the advent of the builds that tend to embrace Soul Ring and Mana Crypt. But at its heart, it's a disruptive aggro deck, which I would call aggro control, really. And my way of describing Death and Taxes is that it's a control deck whose counter spells attack to kill the opponent. So that's why you're going to mulligan more aggressively. So you want to have a few more lands so that you have more options in your mulligans, and you can still expect to get a decent ratio of spells to lands or mana sources when you do mulligan aggressively to find the right cards. So the mana capacity is going to be a little bit higher in this. I'm not certain that this build couldn't go down to 28 to 29 lands off of 30. It'd still be relatively effective. I think at a minimum right now, to make changes in this deck, I likely will pull Mana Confluence out and put in Wasteland, which I don't tend to count Wasteland as a land. Yes, it taps for mana, but this deck's very color intensive. It's very low end, so Wasteland's kind of a spell in this style of deck. We already talked about the one utility land I'm playing, which is Caracas. I'm not playing any man lands in this, creature lands in this. So there's no Treetop Village or anything like that. Then you have the remainder of the pile here, which is 10 fetch lands. So this is a very high fetch count deck. These are going to, because we have a higher land capacity in the deck, it's going to offer you a much greater probability of hitting lands. But at the same time, and I know folks hate to hear this, but it does also thin your deck out a bit, especially when you're running up to 10 of them. When you're running 10, if you're looking at a 3 to 4 turn game, if you fetch 3 to 4 times, the percentiles become significant that you are not going. The percentiles become larger and larger over time that you're not going to hit more lands. And ideally on a deck like this, you want to consistently just hit gas. You want to keep your foot to the floor on it. The biggest reason that I tend to like these higher cap lands or higher cap mana sources, in an aggressive control style deck, is that it does allow you more flexibility in your mulligan decisions, and it does enable you to keep a wider range of starting hands due to mana enrichment in the deck, which I do believe is a real thing. The probabilities of thinning affecting a single draw step is in the less than 1 percentiles, typically speaking, especially when you're on 100 cards. But the probability of having the right land to card mix in your opening 7 or your follow-up 6 or your follow-up 5 is significantly increased because of the raw density, the raw volume of cards that you're drawing, and the slight enrichment that you get due to having a mana base of increased size. Next up, you have the speed mana. So this is only a 9-point list right now. The only card that you could consider running in this style of deck is possibly a Stoneforge Mystic, but right now I'm only running Skull Clamp as an equipment card in this deck. Jit was too many points, and I think what the Moxen give you is significantly better than cutting one of the Moxen and putting in Stoneforge Mystic plus Jit. That's another option you could do, though, is you could put in Jit plus Stoneforge Mystic and cut one of the Moxen. But oftentimes I find that, you don't really want to draw the Moxen late, but if you draw them as your first draw on the draw, or even on the play, or you have them in your opener, they tend to make your hands exceedingly explosive. The deck does have a strong ability to 2-spell on turn 1 if it has a Mox draw. You'll kind of see that in some of the gameplay, and I think in general, you want to get on the board fast and hard with this deck, and then back up your early aggressive plays with removal, with some of the taxi creatures, but basically put them under a clock, put them under pressure, force them to react. They'll react to some of it, and then you'll put down what is really relevant, which is either your 3-drop or your 2-drop tax card that hoses their deck. That's kind of the idea behind it. We're also playing Chrome Mox. Yes, it's card disadvantage, but the ability to cast your spells early, your relevant spells, before they can interact with them, tends to be highly relevant. That's why against control, I tend to think this style of deck is fairly favored, because you can get on the board early with fairly disruptive cards that also put them under a ton of pressure and generally decreases the relevancy of their counter magic, such that they probably need to use some means of vast card advantage removal, which is 4 to 5 mana, against what you've established on the board, which allows you a tap out turn on their side to rebuild the board through cards that you've been collecting up in your hand. But if they do nothing, well, you can just beat them to death and eventually Colossomite one of your 2/1s or whatever and kill them with it. The next pile here is kind of the protective element. You call these card advantage cards. Giver of Runes and Mother of Runes, both very powerful. The fact that Giver of Runes is a 1/2 is actually pretty big. That's a lot of toughness for a 1-drop. Squire Body for 1 mana is pretty cool. Obviously, it doesn't protect itself. It's certainly no Mother of Runes. Mother of Runes is a more powerful card, singularly. But these cards tend to put opponents in a lot of bad positions and forces them to interact with them early to prevent dying in the mid game. Because Giver of Runes, especially against monochromatic decks or decks that tend to run monochromatic threats, their threat package primarily comes out of a certain color. Generally, I'm speaking of green as being the predominant color for where threats come from in most 2 to 3 color decks. Allows you to pass a lot of combat damage and generally win in the mid game with an activation of Giver. All right, the next pile we have here is the pump. There's a lot of pump in this deck, and I'm not sure if all of it's right. Become Immense is just a ton of power for the rate, no trample, but as we go through the threat pile, you'll see that we have a lot of tramplers and a lot of evasive things. Gorklan Rampager can be cast as just a 4/4 trampler, but the big thing with Gorklan Rampager is that it gives you as a pilot a lot of decisions. So the fact that this does have Blood Rush and can be a 2 mana, 4 power, 4 toughness boost plus trample is really big. This is just a great card, and I've been very happy with in this deck. It's also uncounterable if you Blood Rush it. Now, they can effectively counter it by killing the creature that you're trying to put it on, but generally speaking, you're not going to want to use your pump willy-nilly. You're going to want to use it when they're tapped down or when they've made a block during a slight tap out or during basically take advantage of your opponent's actions as best you can with your pump spells. You don't, generally speaking, want to go high-ho silver with them and just try to blow them up. But oftentimes you can just get them that way too. They can, if they're on a less interactive deck like Academy or, let's say Storm, then you could just dump these things onto creature cards and basically fish your deck. Oftentimes I don't advise that you fish your deck because a lot of decks are going to have interaction, but the pump spells tend to be really great against like mid-range decks that tap out for a Kalitas. You tack in with all your stuff. They're pretty much obliged to block or else they generally die because they haven't done much up until that point. You pump your card, whatever it may be, Gaddock Teague with Collision Colossus, or with Colossus half of Collision, and it lives, and the Kalitas dies, and they gain 3 life, but they're down a threat, and they're down 4 mana from the turn prior. Colossal Might, basically Collision Colossus as well, Brute Force, +3/+3, this is a giant growth. It's funny I have this in here because I was thinking about it more. I was actually running Giant Growth at one point in time. I took it out recently. So I played Giant Growth. Actually, I have never played with Blossoming Defense in this deck, but I ended up changing out Giant Growth for Blossoming Defense. So maybe Brute Force requires a relook, and maybe it's another threat we want to run. But generally speaking, I've been pretty happy with just getting 3 power, 3 toughness, and a lot of the removal in the format tends to be red removal, which means it's damage-based, so you can use this at any time just to protect a threat as well from damage-based removal, which is still pretty nice. Blossoming Defense kind of does the same thing, but also kind of ranges up a little bit, or scales up a little better against like the black-based removal that is just straight-up destroy or bury or whatever. Rancor, yep, this is the gift that keeps on giving. Hatred outlives the hateful. It indeed does. If you manage to lock this up without the creature dying in response to its enchantment as an aura, this card will continually come back. The fact that it gives trample is just outrageous. I don't think this card would even be remotely playable without the trample clause on it, but because it gives trample, it becomes so relevant over the game, and the fact that I have all these pump spells to kind of, help bolster that, it just makes it even better. Mutagenic Growth, this card's kind of on the lower end. As far as cards I'm looking to cut, I already talked to Mana Confluence. Mutagenic Growth, possibly a card I could see switching out for possibly another 1 or 2 drop threat. But it's still been quite good. The fact that you can use it when you're tapped out, and it's generally kind of sneaky, and it's a surprise card, tends to be pretty good. And oftentimes what it'll do is just blank, a removal spell, a red-based removal spell, when you're tapped out and your opponent thinks that they're able to get you with it. And at the end of the day, the worst side of it is that it's just a shock in combat. You just use it as a shock, and you kill your opponent with it. The last card here is the big boy, and it's a card that kind of fostered my desire to build this deck. It's Berserk. I love Berserk. The card is it's from the very first set of Magic. And the card is just sweet. It's very, very all in. It's asking for a decent bit to go right and for your opponent to essentially have been put into a spot where they had to tap out to impact the board. And due to the fact they're tapped out, you're not really as worried about, their Go for the Throat, their Doomblade, their Swords to Plowshares, and you just get them. Like, Berserk is just a card that just gets them. And it certainly does. You'll probably see some games where we get folks with it. This next pile here is kind of my interaction pile. I would call it removal, but it's a variety of interaction. You have Lightning Helix at the top end here. This is a racing card. It kills basically anything. It can kill your opponent too. It can dome planeswalkers out, and it gains you life while it's doing it. And most common use, it just keeps the board open so you can keep on attacking with your creatures, and your opponent doesn't really get anything going on their board. Cindervines. This is kind of a tax card. This card actually could get moved over here into the tax pile. It's not a creature, but it is a consistent source of damage against certain decks like Academy, like anything that's running Auriok Salvagers and Black Lotus or Lion's Eye Diamond. It'll kill them when they do that, trying to make infinite mana. You'll only make basically X-1 correction. X minus 1 from your life total, I want to say. Basically, they take 4 damage every time they cycle a Pyrite Spellbomb to do 2 damage, or for each iteration required to get 1 storm count off tendrils, which means that they'll die. Basically, they have to be at double the life that you're at when they try to go for it. If they're at 20 and you're at 10, it'll work for them, but if they're generally not going to be. They're generally going to be getting the dog crap beaten out of them for a couple turns, and Cinder Vines will help with that as they try to establish, whatever combo they're looking to get, because they're generally going to be using non-creature spells to do so. But essentially, they have to be at double the life to kill you with either a spell bomb or with tendrils if this card is in play, which is generally not going to be the case. The fact that the downside of this card is just destroy an enchantment or an artifact and also deal 2 damage, do shock damage to someone at the commitment of 3 total mana, 2 for casting it and 1, is still really high. This card is great. I've been very, very happy with it. It'd be cooler if it was on a creature, but I have some creatures also that do this. They just don't do the shock with it. They're not as difficult to interact with as Cinder Vines is. And Cinder Vines is just a fairly consistent source of damage. Against control combo, even mid-range decks, I tend to find Cinder Vines is fine. It blows up Birthing Pod. It deals with a lot. It blows up Courser of Crewfix, a few other enchantment-based creatures that are out there. So it tends to be quite good. I do think it deserves being moved over to the taxes pile because it does kind of show-stop quite a few decks. Atarka's Command. This card, and you'll find in a lot of these decks, I try to have cards that are flexible and doing multiple things that the deck wants to do. Atarka's Command can be pumped for your whole team. It can stop life gain, which can be relevant. It also buffs your... I'm sorry, I already said that. It already buffs your own whole team. And it also just does damage to each opponent. It's untargeted damage, which is also kind of nice if you're dealing against a Leyline or a True Believer or Aegis of the Gods, etc. This card just does a little bit of everything that this deck kind of wants to be doing, and yeah, it's very good. Goblin Crater Maker. So this card is kind of interesting. I wanted to have cards that are decent at attacking, but also can just deal with a lot of different stuff. So kind of like some old school, Sly Tech, Goblin Crater Maker can blow up an artifact, can blow up Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, can blow up a 2 toughness or less creature. And at the end of the day, if none of that's relevant, it can just attack for 2, which is still just fine. This card's quite good. Sometimes it's only a bear, but when it's not just a bear, it tends to be really good. And actually, this card can kind of go into the taxes pile as well because it deals with so much random stuff that you may want to deal with on this deck. But at the end of the day, it's more so just removal. It's just point removal, which is why it's here. A Braid. Other than not going to face, this card just does everything too. It does 3 damage, deals with any 3 toughness thing. Can't go to face, and can destroy target artifact. I really kind of highly value the ability to point destroy artifacts. With Academy out there, Academy has really high payoff cards, but they tend to be singular. If you can get one of them, it takes the opponent a little while to find another one, and a lot of their artifacts just make mana. They're based around a Tolarian Academy, so they're going to have a lot of artifact mana sources. So in a way, you can kind of almost treat it like a ramp deck. They're going to get their relevant cards out, but if they don't hit them in the right sequence or it takes them a while to find it, and they slip a bit, you can just beat them to death. And a Braid kind of allows you to exacerbate that issue with the deck, basically force them into big mana dead-end draws, which is why I love the card. Arc Trail, 2-for-1 capability here. Oftentimes, I have just cast this to dome someone for 2 and then do 1 to myself or 1 to one of my 2 toughness creatures. It can do that in the low end, but, against other aggressive decks, this card's great. It keeps the board open, makes them, basically be behind. And a lot of other aggressive creatures are not the best defenders, so you can basically turn your creatures into the abyss against your opponent. Use, Brute Forces and Colossal Mites to kill the creatures that they end up having to cast a block with and not aggressively attack you with. After a successful Arc Trail, and basically kill their next creature with a Colossal Might and do them a bunch of damage and put them into bad spots. Dromoka's Command. Card just, again, does a lot of everything. Can stop a Price of Progress if need be. Can stop a Pyroclasm effect if need be. Can get rid of problematic enchantments like Moat, etc. Can get rid of a Courser of Crewfix. I've also used it, I believe, to get rid of a Spirit of the Labyrinth. Against Death and Taxes, and can also fight. So put a +1/+1 counter on something, and then just fight something else and kill it. Very, very strong card. Lightning Bolt, yep, it's in here. It does 3 damage to anything you want, and it's very cheap. And it always has been, and always will be one of the best burn spells ever made. Boros Charm. I mean, until they make a Phyrexian mana for one Phyrexian red mana lightning bolt, that may be better. Boros Charm. So this card's interesting. This card can actually give you some wrath proofing. Can stop all of your stuff from dying to like a Wrath of God effect. Although those aren't as common now. Like generally, you tend to see Terminus and Settle the Wreckage. But you still see Supreme Verdict and sometimes actual literal Wrath of God. Can also give double strike. So this card can protect your stuff, can essentially act as a pump spell, and at the end of the day can just do 4 damage to target player Planeswalker for 2 mana, which is a good rate. So it does a little bit of everything this deck wants to do. Chain Lightning, just very cheap, and can go to face. There's a debate to trying to run Flame Slash in this deck to be able to deal with like Brimazes and stuff like that, but I didn't go that way. I wanted something that was more flexible than that, and, while it doesn't deal with 4 toughness things, it does deal very well with killing the opponent when they're at a low life total. Swords of Plowshares, just pretty ubiquitous removal in any deck that's playing white. It's just that good. It's just very, very good. I mean, you don't want your opponent to be gaining life in this deck, but oftentimes if they're forced to play more into the board, they're not going to be interacting on the stack or interacting with your own board in a direct way. They're going to be dealing with it indirectly through playing blockers, and this kind of keeps them forced to do that. If they don't, then they generally die to the board position, regardless of any of the life gain they've gotten off of it. Soldier of the Pantheon, this is... actually, why are you here? You should be over in the beaters pile. We'll talk that later. Path to Exile, yep, just, again, kills everything. Gives them a land. You don't want to do this mid-game. You don't want to give them an early boosted mana, because our deck tends to want to fight as hard as it can in the early game, transition into victory in the mid-game, and then not get to the long game. And Path to Exile can ramp your opponent into their mid-game a lot faster and generally disadvantage you. So this card's always kind of fraught with some form of peril when you use it. Generally, you want it to be the last removal spell you use, or you want to develop and then use it so that you have overwhelming advantage on board when you do use it. Forked Bolt has the ability to 2-for-1. In some ways, it's like a better Arc Trail. I think it is a better card than Arc Trail. But in decks that have a similar game plan to our own, Forked Bolt tends to be very good because it buys us a lot of time and generally 2-for-1s. Grim Lavamancer, recurring source of damage / card advantage, can kill multiple threats, tends to be good against white weenie style decks. Just all around a good card advantage card for a very cheap rate. This next pile here is the Taxi pile. I'll start up at the top. So Aven Mindcensor is in this deck. I think Aven Mindcensor does enough damage, just simply, alone due to fetch lands, but also due to a lot of the pointed cards being tutors. Due to a lot of like the Tolarian Academy style decks, the combination decks, tend to require a lot of tutoring, transmuting of cards into other cards. Like, it could be Dizzy Spell, it could be Dimir Infiltrator, you name it, Shred Memory. Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Mystical Teachings, Merchant Scroll, Spell Seeker. There are so many things that tutor in this format, and they tend to be the most necessary in the combination style decks, that having an effect that, is really kind of an overcosted body as a 2/1 flyer for 3. But this effect is just really hard to replicate, and there's only a few cards that really do it. You have Aven Mindcensor, you have Leonin Arbiter, and you have Shadow of Doubt. There's probably more. Like, I think Mindlock Orb is another one. That costs like 3 or 4, and it does nothing. It's just an artifact that has no stats on it. Shadow of Doubt, obviously we're not playing because it's off color. It's a 2 hybrid blue-black mana, Debir mana. We're not playing Leonin Arbiter in this deck. It is a 2-mana 2/2, and it's very strong, but I'm running way too many fetch lands and tutor effects of my own to really want to have to do that, because I think more often than not we'll pay the price for using that card more than our opponents will. But Aven Mindcensor, only does this to your opponents. It's a one-sided effect, and it's quite powerful. The fact that it also flies is nice, because oftentimes you can just pass, 4 to 6 damage through with it, or pile it up with a bunch of pump spells to kill them in the air, with all of this nonsense that we have over here. Rampaging Ferocidon. Yes, we are a relatively creature-heavy deck, but Rampaging Ferocidon does a couple things. One, it stops decks like Twin or Kiki Pod from kind of getting you. So in a way, it's a taxing effect. I kind of see this as a taxing effect. Like, you can't indefinitely make clones of something to kill your opponent, especially if you're already at a low life total, because the Rampaging Ferocidon will kill you before you're able to kill me, the pilot of Naya Blitz and Taxes, with your combo. On Crop Crasher, this could possibly go over here just in the beater pile. But I'm kind of treating On-Crop Caster as also kind of a taxing effect. The fact that this can just render like a random Worm Coil Engine cast off a Mishra's Workshop or a Tolarian Academy completely moot for the last damage that you need to get tends to be really relevant. This is a card that I wasn't exceedingly high on when it first got printed. 3 mana is a lot for a card that gets shocked, but the fact that if this thing gets to turn sideways, it generally speaking means your opponent just loses, even if they played a lifelinker or something like that, tends to be really, really strong. Thalia Heretic Cathar, this card just batters decks that are littered with non-basic lands, batters the hell out of mid-range decks and other aggressive decks that are trying to actually win in the combat step because they're just not going to be blocking your stuff and your stuff's going to get through more easily. It's also, despite being shock bait, First Strike is pretty big on a 3-power creature. It tends to kill most things. It can trade favorably with Thragtusk. You name it. It does quite a bit. Decent-sized body for a good rate that has a very highly relevant taxing effect that will tend to essentially operate as a time walk or two in the right matchups. Eidolon of the Great Revel, definitely a tax card. I think most folks think of this card as being an aggressive card, but I look at it as being more of a tax card, counterspell on wheels, if you will. This tends to blank storm decks. They need to kill it. The fact that we are a Blitz-style deck means that we have a ton of pump, which means we can tend to protect it from cards like Fire Ice, Forked Bolt, whatever Storm may be playing. You also have stuff like Blossoming Defense and Giver of Runes to protect it from Spellbomb, Aether Spellbomb specifically, to keep this thing on the board, and it just tends to house those style of decks, like the Storm decks. Harsh Mentor, this can showstop Time Vault style decks. This means that basically every time they take an extra Time Vault or Time Walk turn, especially if they're at already a lower life total, which they'll tend to be because you're beating the living crap out of them with 1-drops and 2-drops, it means they're taking 2 damage, so they need to find what they're trying to find relatively quickly. This also tends to be pretty good against the Academy style decks. There's quite a few things that they can do, like sacking some of their stones for cards, sacking memory jars, fetch lands, anything with Sensei's Divining Top, stuff like that. This card does quite a bit against a lot of the combination style decks and a lot of the decks that have, again, fetch lands. Each fetch land's 2 damage off of a Harsh Mentor. Cinder Vines, we already talked this. We put it over in the tax effects. I'm not going to talk it much further. It's just a really good card, I think, in decks that can run it. Spirit of the Labyrinth. This card is kind of one of my bullets against the Academy decks that are going to be running draw 7s or will have massive amounts of draw, i.e. High Tide, blue-white to an extent. Mostly decks that are going to rely on cantrips to kind of smooth out their draw, but also maintain card parity with them. Anytime you can turn cantrips into indexes, you tend to be in a very happy place. They're still going to have a little more command over variance, but the cards are not going to one-for-one replace themselves. They're going to be down cards when they're doing it. Tithe Taker. Yep, this card's pretty cool. My estimate of this card's gone up significantly. I could run a card gotta think, guys. Grand Abolisher. But it's too white for a 2-2. Slightly better body with more defensive capability. It totally stops interaction on your turn. But the fact that it's hard to cast, it being at 2 white, and the fact that if it just gets shocked, it's just gone, kind of stinks. The fact that this thing turns into a 1/1 flyer after it dies is pretty cool. Works better with stuff like Skull Clamp. Also just keeps bodies around after Wrath effects. And honestly, you'd be shocked at how often it becomes relevant that your opponents are forced to do things on their own turn because everything costs 1 more to do on my own turn for them. So that may just be casting spells. It may be activating abilities like Grim Lavamancer, but it does tend to actually take a pretty important toll. That includes fetch lands too. You can't fetch unless you pay 1. So it's actually a pretty impactful card, more impactful than you'd think. Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. This card, again, houses Storm, houses the Spells Matter style decks. And it's a reasonable body for the rate. I think it's quite good. Yes, it does make some of our own spells, like these over here, and a lot of these removal spells here, a little bit more to cast, but oftentimes you only need 2 removal spells or 1 pump spell to actually really just win the game with your early onboard advantage that you acquire through your aggressive threats. Scavenging Ooze. It's a showstop reanimator-style strategy. It's also quite good against Storm. Gains you some incremental life, so it's good against mid-range and aggressive decks where you'll be trading off creatures regularly. This card is just all around a great card. I don't think there's matchups where it's not as good, but generally speaking, Scavenging Ooze just does a significant amount of work in any game that it's in. Also very easy to cast. Not as easy to activate multiple times in a turn with this deck because we do have a wider spread of mana requirements. But, at the end of the day, it's often going to be a 4/4. It's often going to gain you 2 life, and it's often going to, eat up some creatures and trade for some stuff. Gattig, this card also just stops some things. Like, it's really good against Storm. It tends to be good against decks that are running like Wrath of God effects, Supreme Wills, Settle the Wreckages, Entreat the Angels, you name it. Also shuts off Green Sun Zenith. And I do not believe it shuts off a single card inside our deck. Nope, it does not. Kasali Pride Mage, again, just more artifacts, enchantment removal. I have a significant bit of it in this deck, despite not having like a committed deck that just houses that. And I think that's fine to have. I think, artifacts tend to be some of the more spooky things to interact with and deal with. So do enchantments like moats. And having cards like Goblin Crater Maker that can deal with artifacts, Kasali Pride Mage, Dromoka's Command, and a Braid just tend to be really good. So we have quite a few ways to deal with that sort of thing. And actually, correction, Cinder Vines is also on that list. There's quite a few ways. Voice of Resurgence, kind of a tax card. Generally stops counter spells, stops removal on your turn. Since we're a Blitz deck, you tend to want to have protection on your own turn. And, you feel a lot less bad about, casting a Mutagenic Growth or a Brute Force on your attacking creature for lethal and having your opponent remove it. When you have a Voice of Resurgence in play and you get like a 4/4 or a 5/5 out of that exchange, basically your opponent's still down cards and they've just basically bought time to try to draw into what they need to draw into. A Phyrexian Revoker. This card also, again, for 2 mana, not a great clock. It's 2/1, which the going rate for just a solely a 2/1 should be 1 mana in this style of deck to have the most lean mana curve. But Phyrexian Revoker just stops enough that I think it tends to be good. I've named Time Vault with this. I've named certain Planeswalkers. I've named Moxen of different varieties. I've named Mana Dorks, and generally it buys you a couple turns. It buys you a turn or so, and could just fundamentally shut off the way an opponent's deck operates. Dryad Militant, a great beater, 1 mana 2/1, which is good, as we were just talking about. And it exiles all instants and sorceries that would be put in a graveyard from anywhere. So exile instead. So if someone Hermit Druids, all that stuff is gone except the creatures. Any spells that Stormcast are going away. So the card is just quite good. It has a great tax effect. Probably, in my opinion, definitely a known card and a played card, but one of the most underrated 1 mana cards in Death and Taxes is this card, Dryad Militant, because of the work it does against some of the unfair decks of the format. Deathrite Shaman, not a lot of ways to exile instant sorceries to actually do life loss. I have put in a Bayou, and there's a ton of fetch lands, so it's not impossible to activate this thing. But more commonly what it's going to do is just ramp you a little bit. It's also a good hedge bet against Reanimator. Because we're running a high amount of fetch lands, typically speaking, it's going to almost act as a suspended Moxen, or Mox, rather. And it can also just gain you life in racing situations. So I'm pretty happy with Deathrite Shaman. I could see replacing it just for solely a 2/1, but I think it's still just good enough. It does a significant bit of work, and the fact that it can give you a little bit more of an edge against like Reanimator decks tends to be kind of nice. Next pile here is the pure threats. So what I've tried to do here is, as much as possible, choose threats that for the rate are at the top end. Or, we have some cards that kind of like feel out of place, like Tattermunge Maniac. The reason I chose Tattermunge over a card like Jungle Lion, even though I guess they're about basically the same card, they're pretty close to the same card, is that Tattermunge Maniac is just easier to cast. And the fact that it's easier to cast is kind of what sold me on it. I'm like, yeah, it's just easier to cast. It's not a singular mana requirement. Like I can use green or red mana, and since we're playing, white in this deck, you could end up in a case where you have Plateau and you want to still cast a 2/1 on turn 1. And Jungle Lion would be worse in that case because you have greater flexibility with a card like Tattermunge. Going up to the top, though, as much as possible, I'm trying to play the most singularly effective or self-protecting, uninteractive threats as I can. So like Goblin Rabblemaster, the general theory of play with this card is they have to react to the board. They react to the board, then you cast this thing and get a free 1/1. They react to this thing, kill it, you have a 1/1 attacking them each turn, and you play a follow-up threat after you've done this. Or if you just cast this thing, do nothing, the card just runs away with the game all on its own. It just needs to be dealt with. You don't have to play more around after you play this card. They have to deal with it. If they don't, they die within 2 to 3 turns. Legion Warboss, same story. Basically, a very similar card. It makes a singularly less big threat, but it makes more bigger threats, if that makes sense. Spreads out the love, the damage, if you will. But these cards are very, very, very similar. Another card that I consider running is the new Krenko. The 3 mana, I think 2/3 Krenko. No, 1/2. When you attack with him, he gets a +1/+1 counter, and you create X goblins where X is equal to the power of Krenko. The fact that he doesn't make a goblin the turn he comes into play is the reason I didn't end up running him. Plus, he's a legend, which means at 3 mana, I don't generally tend to want to have my legends get bounced at 3 mana. And he also just doesn't give you any initial value off playing him. I think over time he is a better card, and I am running him in Mardu and stuff like that has less threat density than this deck does, because I think he's more powerful than these cards are in general. But the fact that he has some liabilities against Karakas, and the fact that he doesn't do anything the turn he comes in, I think made him a cut. I have tested him in the build, though, and I'm not unwilling to say that maybe he shouldn't be in here, the new Krenko. Let's pull that card up real fast on the card reader so you guys can see it. Krenko. There's a few Krenkos now, so make sure you know I'm 10 Street Hula, or 10 Street Kingpin. Yeah, this is a card right here. 3 mana, 1/2. Whenever he attacks, put +1/+1 counter on it, then create a number of 1/1 red goblin creature tokens equal to Krenko's power. Note they're not attacking, so you're just getting a bunch of dudes. I have won games with this card. It's very powerful, but I don't think it's quite exactly. It's a little bit more investment heavy than Legion War Boss and Goblin Rabble Master, and that's kind of where I want to be. I want to have cards that can have immediate impact on the board and on my opponent's life total, and also continue to scale decently well into the long game as an investment. And Legion War Boss and Goblin Rabble Master are kind of like the exemplars of this effect, and why these cards are just such powerhouses. Gruul Spellbreaker, just a tougher card to interact with once it hits the board. You can counterspell it, but it's just tough to deal with, before it hits the board. When it hits the board. Hard to kill. They got to do it on their turn. Kari Zev, Skyship Raider. So I was kind of low on this card when it first got printed, but the fact that red tends to be a pretty heavily used color to remove creatures in the format kind of brought me over to this card more. It can't be Fire Iced, it can't be Fork Bolted, it can't be Arc Trailed. It's tough to block, even though a 1-power attacker is not great. You can randomly enough protect it with your own Karakas, which I've done in a game recently, to keep it from getting wrathed or blown up with the rest of your stuff. Card's just fine, and it's also just 2 mana, so it's very little. It's a 3-power attacker, essentially split apart on 2 bodies, one of which is blockable easily, but I think the card's just fine. Stormblood Berserker, as you can see in this deck, we're going to be attacking a lot, so it's not too hard to get Stormblood Berserker to a 3/3, and the fact that it has Menace and is difficult to block, and is a 3/3 body for 2 mana, it kind of sold me on it. Then we also have Scab Clan Mauler, green and red, a Gruul, if you will. 1/1 with Bloodthirst 2 and Trample. So, kind of like Stormblood Berserker, except in the fact that it has Trample, which means that a lot of these cards over here, our pump spells, become more relevant. A lot of them already give Trample, but some don't. Become Immense does not. And this card gets a lot better that way, or when you have those type effects in your deck. It's also cheap, and in general it's going to be a 3/3. You don't want to play it as a 1/1, but good card. Tarmogoyf, just big, beats up aggro, scales well against mid-range, is a great singular threat to play against control. If they counter it, great, you play another threat out, but generally speaking, you can just play this card, and they're going to eventually have to Wrath of God it, and then you can play out 2 more threats. Fleecemane Lion, this is kind of basically, it's generally just going to be Watch Wolf in this deck, basically 3/3 for 2. But the fact that you can Monstrosity it when your opponent's tapped out, and make it hexproof and indestructible is so strong. Then basically they're looking to deal with it with Council's Judgment or something along those lines. Zertog Goblin, again, just a beater. Can be a 3/3 for 2 when you want it. Can also just be a hasty 2/2, which kind of in a lot of ways makes it better than a straight up Watch Wolf, which we're not playing Watch Wolf in the list. We'll take Brawler, 3/2 for 2, which is good. Again, 3-power attacker, but when it attacks, it becomes a 4/3. So 4 power for 2 mana is pretty good. And really, you can only do this twice because you only get 2 energy when it initially enters the battlefield. You don't get energy every time it attacks like you would with Long Tusk Cub. But just being able to attack for 4 twice and it having Trample when you use the energy on it is pretty powerful. Ismaru, Hound of Khanda. This is the only vanilla 1-drop in white that I'm playing. The reason that I ended up going with Ismaru is because it helps fade Arc Trail, the maximal utility of Arc Trail, and Forked Bolt and Fire Ice and Electrolyze. They're pretty common removal spells if you're playing against Jeskai, and I kind of like the 2 toughness on this thing as opposed to anything else like an Expedition Envoy or Savannah Lions. We're not quite so deep that we're playing Savannah Lions in this list. It's actually one of the things I wanted to avoid. Talking of Savannah Lions, here is one of the better Savannah Lions ever printed. Kythian, Hero of Akros, I want to say his name is. 1 mana 2/1 for 2 and a white, because you probably can't read that on the card reader. You can make this card indestructible. If you attack with 3 or more creature cards, Kithian turns into Gideon Battleforge, which is essentially a 4-power attacker on the following turn, can force a creature to attack it, the Gideon Battleforged, on the opposing side's next turn, and also can untap one of your creatures and make it indestructible until the following turn. Loam Lion, this is basically a time-shifted, in a way, Curd Ape that is typically going to be a 2-3 in this deck, and a 1-mana 2-3 is a great rate. Also, it resists the shocks, which tends to be really good. I'll jump down a little bit. We also have Curd Ape, the original art, Arabian Nights Curd Ape here, which is just a pretty solid card. I mean, for 1 mana, a 2-3 is a hell of a rate. It certainly is no Wild Mikado, which can become a 3-3 and oftentimes does in this deck. But having 3 toughness tends to be really big, and these cards just tend to be tougher to deal with for the rate that you're getting them at. I am playing Zergo Bellstriker as well. The reason I actually have this guy in here is... again, it's a good rate for a 2-2, but the fact that you can also dash this in is not irrelevant. It's kind of what sold me on it as being one of the 1-drops in a red that I wanted to run. The fact that I can just use this thing as a 2-mana shock is kind of nice. Like, if you don't want to overcommit to the board, you can just dash this guy in, smack him for 2, and get it back in hand. And maybe they have to spend resources getting it out of your hand with, like, an Inquisition or a Thoughtseize, which they may be taking 2 damage at that point, or, they have to wrath the board and you still have this as a threat, and you keep on dashing it in and beating the living crap out of them until they counter it. Figure of Destiny, this card is just, one, it's easy to cast because it is castable off of 2 of the colors that we're playing in the deck, and it also can scale well over time. It's just a threat that, if you need a mana sink, you can have a mana sink in your aggressive deck, but if you don't have the mana to sink into it, well, it's still just fine. It's going to be a 2-2 for 1, or a 2-2 for 2, essentially, because you have to put mana into it to make it a 2-2. Tattermunch, again, just easy to cast. 2-1, not great card, has to attack every turn, but, it's 2 of our colors, and hybrid mana casting cost, and just easy to get down. Pale Collector, yep, just great. This card grows. We have 2 of this type effect. We have this and Experiment 1. Pale Collector eventually gets trample. Whenever anything that is bigger than it enters the battlefield, or dies, right? Yeah, dies. It gets another +1/+1 counter on it, which is big. This thing's oftentimes a 3-3 or a 4-4. And the fact that it can get trample is pretty nice. Experiment 1, also very nice card. Tends to be a 3-3 or a 4-4 in the deck over enough time. It just generally attacks for a lot of damage. The fact that you can regenerate this thing is just fine, too. I mean, if you need to protect it from, like, not a Wrath of God, but like a Supreme Verdict or something like that, you can do so. Wild Mikado, 1 mana 3-3, basically. Very, very good. Hex Drinker, been pretty high on this card. Again, it's a 2-1, but, it's another mana sink. For an aggressive deck, which I think aggressive decks don't mind having mana sinks, especially ones that kind of help promote their primary game plan, which is to kill your opponent through life or through damage in the combat step. And Hex Drinker's been pretty cool. I've used it to kill a few folks. It gets big pretty quick, and protection from instants is pretty relevant. The only downside to protection from instants is that we are running some instants ourselves. Something you have to watch out for. Like sometimes you get it to a point where like you can't actually cast this stuff on it. Obviously you can't cast a Rancor. Well, you can cast a Rancor on this, but you can't cast a Blossoming Defense on Progenitus either. And this card I think eventually becomes kind of a Progenitus. Protection from everything. Yeah, it means you can't enchant it anymore with Rancor or use your combat tricks on it. But if you're getting to a point where you've spent 8 mana on Hex Drinker, you're probably winning regardless. Curd Ape, already talked to. Goblin Guide, just a hasty 2-2 for 1. This card's just really good. That's why we're running it. It's just a fast source of damage. Does a lot of damage real quick and adds up quickly. Yes, it can be a source of card disadvantage for you if it's giving your opponent lands, but when it's not, it generally tends to give you some very useful information as the pilot actually running the Goblin Guide as well. Soldier of the Pantheon. Again, this is just a 1 mana 2-1, but it does have protection from multicolored, which means that it has protection from stuff like Assassin's Trophy, Abrupt Decay, Electrolyze, which is kind of nice. Is It Charm? Quite a few things that this thing, and it's unblockable by Kitchen Finks, by opposing Figures of Destiny. You name it. There's protection from multicolored is not an irrelevant line of text. I've oftentimes found it to be quite relevant, and also it can gain you life against certain spells. If you have your opponent, casting stuff like Boros Charm or like Lightning Helix. Lightning Helix is another good example of what it has protection from. Then you can just be gaining random incremental life, which can tend to extend the game long enough to continue to keep you in it against another aggressive strat. Skull Clamp. This is kind of an interesting card in this deck. I'm trying it for now. I kind of wanted to have an additional source of card advantage in this deck to allow me to go kind of over the top of other aggressive strategies. And Skull Clamp, and also at the same time, like, give me a little bit of increased range against like the control decks of the format. And I think Skull Clamp does that just fine. And the other piece of Skull Clamp is, like, if you're playing against, like, just straight up hard combo, like, there are going to be times that, like, I know I'm going to need to find a hate piece to even hopefully win. And I can kind of trade off some of my resources that are not as relevant, like my 2/1s, to draw into those cards that I think I need to win the matchup. So it kind of does that too. Then you have Smuggler's Copter, which is kind of just a pure threat. You can put it over here in the pure threat pile. It's a 2-mana 3/3 flyer, basically. But the fact that it allows you to filter your cards, get rid of lands when you don't want lands and find threats, get rid of threats when you need mana sources, you name it. Like, Smuggler's Copter kind of breaks the laws of aggressive decks by giving you the ability to filter your cards while still doing a significant amount of damage for the mana rate at which you're paying for it. So it kind of does all of the above. So, guys, that is the deck. I have playtested with it a decent bit. Again, the idea behind the deck is that we want to have roughly equivalent to, or about 1 turn to a half turn clock speed equivalency to Red-Green Blitz or RG Blitz, but also have added range against certain archetypes that RG Blitz is more soft to by having tax-style cards that come out of the Death and Taxes builds. I think the deck theory, the concept, and the theory of play has gotten there. The deck's been quite successful. I've generally tended to give folks quite a beatdown with this deck. And I played it in a recent league, run over the Discord, and ended up going 4-0 with the list against a pretty decent range of decks. So I'm going to cover some of those games, as well as cover some other games that I've played with the deck, and hopefully, kind of showcase the strategies, benefits over other aggressive or aggressive control decks in the format. And, hopefully that is of benefit, and that is the deck, guys. So I'm going to go ahead and cut it there, or pause there, and I'll be back momentarily with more gameplay of the deck. At this point in time, if you are interested in seeing specific matchups, and you've just watched this deck tech, please go to the comments section to reference again. There will be some highlighted comments in there that have timestamps for each of the matchups. Back at you momentarily, guys. Later. Alrighty, guys, we are back, and this is going to be the first game first match we cover. I'm playing against Rans Heroica. So we're going to play against blue-white control here. I do not know what my opponent's on. I don't have a good guess either, because this is the first time I actually played this player in league play. His hand's great, though. It's possibly one land short of where we'd want to be, but the fact that we can get like a taiga or a plateau, or actually, I'm sorry, a savannah would probably be the right pickup with this hand. Get a Harsh Mentor down turn 1, and then kind of put them under duress here is pretty solid. We're not on the play, though, so that is one unfortunate part to this hand. They cast out an Ancestral Vision, and I'm like, alright, this hand's going to be good against an Ancestral Vision deck, and it's possible that we can render their Ancestral Vision moot. So if I had a Taiga here because I drew into a Horizon Canopy, I'd rather have 2 red-greens, or 2 red sources, than I would an additional white source in this deck. White tends to be the least represented color in it. Zergo comes out, as does Cindervines. They fetch, taking 2 damage off the Harsh Mentor from their Prismatic Vista, and taking 2 off the Harsh Mentor in combat step down to 15. Untapped land comes out, Detention Sphere, sucking down the Harsh Mentor. Get in for 2. Play out the Kithian here. Now, one thing I could have done is I could have gone for a Brute Force plus Berserk line. I believe they'd be at like something like 5 or 4 right now if I had done that. This would have been like a 5/5, so they go up to plus 2, 13. This becomes a 5-power attacker plus 5. I would have put them at 3 life. I could have done that, but what I would have to do instead is leave up a Braid here. Plus, I'd lose my 2/2 out of that exchange, and I'd only have a Kithian in play. So I don't think it was worth it. They were tapped out, so it was an option. I found my own Prismatic Vista here. What I'm going to do this turn is if they tap out for something like a Vidillion Click or a Snapcaster, then I'll probably just go for the kill. But when they don't, I opt not to do that. I'm going to let them have this Ancestral Vision. My assumption is here, like, they have to go for a Wrath of God. And if they don't go for, like, a Wrath of God that, exiles my stuff, I can save the Kithian and then kill them on the following turn if they go for a 4-drop card. So they end up going for Archmage's Charm here, and at this point, I just opt to go for it. I'm going to attack them, allow them to block, and then go for Brute Force plus Berserk to put them at something like -3 or 4. And, yeah, and they just conceded. That would have put them at -2, I'm sorry. So we end up getting them there. Quick pause, guys. We'll be back for Blue-White. I think it's Blue-White Miracles versus Naya Blitz and Taxes. Alrighty, folks. We are back. Alright, pretty similar hand to the first one, except we're going to have to exile a card in this one. We are in the draw, which means Chromox's card disadvantage is a little bit mitigated here. And probably going to exile the Path to Exile. I don't think Path to Exile is going to be exceedingly relevant in this matchup. There's some credence to keeping it. End up exiling it here and putting down the Harsh Venture again. They play on Snow-Covered Plains, say go. Draw on an Arc Trail. Arc Trail's fine. It's not really a great draw against this deck. They play on a Snapcaster Mage to just block my Harsh Venture, which I'm pretty happy with, because now I'm going to play my land in main 2 and resolve the Goblin Rabblemaster. I didn't resolve Goblin Rabblemaster main 1 because I didn't want to run into Counterspell there of any sort. It's very possible they don't have any, but the likelihood of them having nothing to do against my turn 2 play when they do nothing on their own turn 2 is pretty low. It would have meant they kept a bad hand. Which I'm not going to assume my opponent kept a bad hand, and it looks like they kept a Snapcaster hoping to be able to snipe one of my attackers early on. They get a Detention Sphere out, but again, our Detention Sphere is fine here because we've already gotten to attack for essentially 4 damage off of the Rebel Master, and one of that damage is going to stay behind on the Goblin that it created. Cast out a Scavenging Ooze, which is fine. There's 2 creatures in the bin, and we have 2 green mana to start building it up. I have Karakas to protect the Kari Zev at this point, so I can at least save her as a threat if we get Wrath of God, if an additional white mana shows up. My assumption is if they have a Wrath of God, they're probably going to try to Field of Ruin on my next turn to get their secondary white source and then kill me. Instead, they cast on a Narset Transcendent Master. I'll say right now, I'm not a fan of Narset Transcendent Master or Narset Transcendent. I think she's very good in control matchups, but the problem is she has a very high probability of just doing absolutely nothing. You get to look at the top card. If it's a non-creature, non-land card, you may reveal and put it in your hand. So basically, any lands are going to be goose eggs, and here you see my opponent takes it up twice, finds nothing off of it, and just dies. The card tends to be okay in control matchups. I think it's fine there. But it doesn't really protect itself. The only way it protects itself is by you having cards that are board impacting. Cards that the rebound effect can actually, help keep you alive or keep your Narset alive. And if you're -2ing this thing down to 4, it's probably going to die in the next combat step. Generally speaking, against aggressive strategies, it doesn't really do a ton until it ultimates against our combo. The only matchup that's really great in is Control v Control. So I'm not really a huge fan of Narset Transcendent. That's not to knock Rance Heroic in their building. I think he or she is newer to the format. I played them in multiple games afterwards, but that's just for anyone's edification, just my own opinion as well. You may have found that Narset is just great. Me personally, nope, wouldn't do it in blue-white. I think there's too much necessity to be able to impact the board and or impact the stack to play a 4-mana kind of do-nothing card in and of itself. If you're going to be tapping down your mana, you want it to either have board impact or to impact what is relevant in the game state you're in. And Narset really doesn't do any of that. She kind of is just like an expensive Sylvan Library, Sylvan Library that sometimes may just tick up for 2 turns and do nothing. May not find you a damn thing. That said, she can be powerful in the long game if left undeterred. But the problem with cards like that, and the reason why I think a lot of folks misassess them, is that they're essentially win more cards. By the time you're doing that, you're already winning. If Narset's relevant, my general argument would be is that you're already winning regardless, and why not play a card like Jace the Mind Sculptor that actually does give you a card every turn, can have board impact by literally bouncing a 3 or 4 mana spell to force your opponent to recast it, and also operates as a long-term win condition in and of itself. Narset in and of itself cannot win the game. It can stop the opponent from basically winning the game on certain strategies, but to get to that point takes some time, right? So that's kind of just my hot take on Narset. If you were on the fence about playing her, she's an older card at this point, but I've seen her in some decks on again, off again. I don't think she's generally correct. Anyways, guys, quick pause. We'll be back for the next game. Alrighty, guys, London Mulligan is now part of MTGO, which is awesome because the London Mulligan is stellar. Let me tell you, I love this Mulligan rule. It's also a part of Canadian Highlander now. I believe it was effective as of today, the 11th, but it's been effective on MTGO longer, so we've had to play it with that. Let's I'm playing against Croc64. Croc, I think his favored decks, I think he is typically in competitive play played Jeskai midrange. I've seen him, I think, promote Panther Paw, which is a port over from 7-point Aussielander, or Australian Highlander. I don't know what he's going to be playing today. This is my keep on 6. So I'm on 6 right now. I'm not going to mulligan to 5. I'm going to get rid of the Giant Growth here and basically have a 2-lander on box 1-lander. Which is a fine hand. If I draw no land, I can play the Rampaging Ferocidon. I have a pretty strong, I have a decent turn 1. I'd rather this be Mox Emerald. If it was Mox Emerald, this hand would be great. Like, you just play out the Experiment 1, play out Hex Drinker, boost the Experiment 1, pump the Hex Drinker to 3 on the following turn if I hit a land, making it a 4-power attacker with 6 total power on the board by turn 2. That'd be great. Not quite that good, but this hand's certainly keepable on 6. So let's go through the game. Get rid of the Giant Growth. Giant Growth has come out of the deck. You didn't see it in my build because I removed it for Blossoming Defense, which is a card I frankly just forgot about. I go ahead and boost the Hex Drinker on 1. This gives me options if I want to put it to 3 on the following turn and have a 4/4 with protection from instants. But it plays a Razor Verge Thicket, so I don't know what they're on now. They're certainly not on Jeskai. That's not a Jeskai land. What I have to do here is play Mother of Runes. It's kind of a fishing attempt. I want to see if they have Swords to Plowshares or Path to Exile here. Because if I just go Hi-Ho Silver on Hex Drinker and they have Swords to Plowshares or Path to Exile, I kind of just lost my turn. I don't want to lose my turn. They play a Noble Hierarch. I'm still kind of in wonderment of what they're playing. Maybe they're playing Selesnya midrange. I have a good start against Selesnya midrange, though. Mother of Runes is good versus Selesnya midrange. Outside of, like, Jit. Even Jit, it's pretty good against. And I have a really solid attacker on board, a 6/4 attacker, that is, with protection from instants plus a Mother of Runes and a Path to Exile to boot. What I ended up doing this game, they conceded here. Now I know what they're on. I see Danitha Capatian Paragon. This card's interesting. What it means to me is that they're likely playing the Sanctum Stompy list. Sanctum Stompy's pretty cool. I think it did okay in like a recent 1K or something like that. My problem with the deck is, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of Bogle's. It's kind of a Tron-style list that requires a lot of its threats to stay in play. And it plays kind of a lot of non-sequitur cards that allow you to accrue vast card advantage, which ostensibly in some matchups is very good, but it decreases the overall coherence of what is, in its heart, an aggressive strategy that has card engines that are atypical of aggressive decks. All of that nonsense said, basically it's an inconsistent aggressive deck. You could say that like Naya is a less consistent variant of like red deck wins. You wouldn't be wrong, but what you gain from it I think is more substantial than what you gain from a list like Sanctum Stompy that is requiring a lot more for it to go right, and it's generally going to lose multiple turns of clock and virtual advantage at the expense of more suboptimal cards that require other cards to make them great. Now that said, once you establish your Tron in a card like Sanctum Stompy or like Bogle's, you're just gonna win. Like you're against a fair deck like what I'm playing. But the upside on my deck is that each of my independent cards is better in and of itself, so on its own. So I require less to go right with my draw. I require less in my opening hand to have synergy than their deck does, which I think in general is kind of where you want to be on an aggressive deck. That's kind of why I think like mixing the two strategies. Oh, hey, what's up, Jordan? Sorry, guys, you got a visitor here. I think mixing the two strategies kind of tends to put the deck at odds, right? Because you're hoping to have these vast card engines kind of take over, but at the same time, in order to play those investment type cards, you're not sufficiently clocking your opponent, which gives them more time to set up. So all that said, I'm not as big a fan of those style of decks. I think they accept a lot of risk that they don't per se need to for very little gain, but they're sweet. Don't get me wrong, I think they're sweet. But as you can see here, like just, I have a 6/4. I have a Crawl Worm that has protection from instants and a Mother of Runes. That's just enough. That's just enough to beat them to death. And that's that. And I have Path to Exile. Which what's going to happen here is I'm going to wait till their next upkeep. They're going to draw Danitha. I'm going to see if they have a land on top. If they don't have a land on top, I'll allow the Courser of Crufix to likely stay in play because we know they're hellbent on lands at a minimum right now. If there is a land on top after they draw Danitha, I will Path to Exile the Courser of Crufix, and I will swing in there for 6. They're going to have to tap the Noble Hierarch to cast this Danitha. I can use the Mother of Runes to protect the Hex Drinker, or I can just attack in and dome them for 4 and play like a Tide Taker out and kill them with lethal on the following turn. So, that is that, guys. That's game 1. And we'll go to game 2 in Naya Blitz Taxes versus Sanctum Stompy. Alright, guys. Back for game 2 against Selesnya Sanctum Stompy. Alright, so first hand's a mulligan. This hand is weak. but it's going to be a 6 that I'm going to keep. It has all the mana requirements it needs. It has 1, 2, 3 drop, and Mana Confluence is going to go to the bottom of the deck. So let's play it out. Oh no! I'm sorry, guys. This is highly unprofessional of me. I can't believe Jordan just demolished a beta swamp. That's terrible. That's horrible. Oh no. That's probably $40 down the tubes. I don't even know what a beta swamp goes for anymore. I don't tend to play with betas. IRL, as it were. Alright, so this game. Sorry, guys. That's just distressing news. So anyways, opponent mulligans a 6. Plays out turn 1 Soul Ring. Soul Ring, obviously a very powerful card. It tends to be in hands that you keep based upon the power of it. I don't have a way to deal with it right now, so I just play out a Soldier of the Pantheon and hope that it's going to get in there for a significant bit of damage. Opponent plays down a Hero Virois, but no other land. I mize, but I also have like 5 or 6 ways of dealing with artifacts. But I do get lucky and I draw on a Braid and blow up the Soul Ring. Now, this is an interesting play, so let me pause it real quick. I could have opted to blow up the Hero Virois, because if they enchant the Hero Virois, it's going to essentially become out of range. It's going to come out of range for my cards. Like, my cards are not going to deal well with 4/4s and 5/5s. I mean, I do have like Swords of Plowshares and Path to Exile. But at the end of the day, if they cast like, I don't know, like an Umbra on this thing, and then like a Daybreak Coronet. I don't know how all in this build is of the deck. Then I'm going to be in some trouble. That said, they did mulligan to 6, and they kept a Soul Ring hand. I was able to get lucky and deal with the Soul Ring on turn 2 after presenting a turn 1 threat. The likelihood that they have a 1 mana enchantment to cast this thing, or I'm sorry, a 2 mana, a 1 colored or 1 colorless. 1 colored resource enchantment that they can cast because Hero Virois reduces its cost, or a 1 mana enchantment like Rancor on Hero Virois is a little bit lower. If they do and they get the toughness to 3 on Hero Virois, I'm in a much worse spot because at that point, my Forked Bolt's not going to deal with it. So there's an argument to Forked Bolting the Hero Virois, but then I kind of put myself in a spot where I'm not really using my mana efficiently. So what I have to do instead is use the Abrade not to kill the Hero Virois, but for the highest upside, which is I get to use my mana as efficiently as possible and maximize my actual spell throughput by blowing up their Soul Ring, hoping they will not hit a further land based on their keep, and or cannot cast another spell in their hand, which seems fairly likely. Forked Bolt into Thalia on the following turn to make any follow-on enchantments harder to cast, and leaving them with an open board while they're relatively low on land resources. That's kind of why I take my line here. And it could go honestly either way. If they get lucky and hit a land, they could have enchanted this thing, and I'd be in a lot of trouble. They cycle a cast down here after their hero dies. I cast down a Thalia. Again, this is kind of one of the frailties of the more Tron-style aggressive decks, is that they require a lot more cards to go right. Like, Hero Virois is a bear at the end of the day. He's kind of a suboptimal bear at the end of the day, but once you start enchanting him, then he becomes really good. Like, if you dump a Hero Virois and put 2 enchantments on it, it's probably damn near unbeatable for my deck outside of, very few cards like, Dromoka's Command. They cast on a Fabled Hero as well. Comes to play tap because of the Thalia Heretic Athar, which I played before the Rampaging Ferocidon because I think leaving, disabling a lot of their mana resources, as well as having all of their creatures, which I think if they're able to Tron out will be better than my own. Come into play tap, which gives me an extra turn on the combat step to get them down to a point where almost any of my threats are lethal. But Dromoka's Command is also a stellar draw because it allows me to remove the Fabled Hero with Thalia. Double Strike and First Strike are not abilities that are impacted during fighting. So basically, 2 damage happens to my Thalia's 3 damage after +1/+1 counter hits, and 4 damage goes to the Fabled Hero, killing it. And I'm able to attack in for, 8 damage, putting them to 3. Which is pretty dead. They tend to think the same thing, and they go ahead and pack it in here with Selesnya Sanctum Stompy, and Naya Aggro Taxes gets them. So, quick pause, guys. We'll be back for the next match in these match sets. Alright, guys, we are back. Playing against Stefan JJ here. This is going to be an Academy matchup. Stefan is a Victoria player. He tends to vary up his deck selection significantly. I played Stefan on Blue Red Moon. I believe Jeskai, mid-range to mid-range control. I played him when he's playing mono green Eldrazi, like medium green / green ramp, big green, like a channel deck. And today, which I don't know what he's going to be playing, because he's a player who has a decent range, he's going to be playing an Academy-based deck, I believe. I don't know if it's Academy or if it's just like it's a workshop deck. I don't think I ever see Academy out of him, but my guess is he's playing Academy. This is a fine hand. It's got 1-drop, 2-drop, some pump, some removal. In the dark, I think it's fine. It has all its mana as well. So I see an island and a ponder. I'm thinking like Blue Moon, which his hand's great against Blue Moon. And then I see Mishra's Workshop, and I'm like, oh, we're not playing against Blue Moon, we're playing against an artifact deck. So my game plan just kind of changed drastically. Like, playing Mishra's Workshop gives me a lot of information about what he's up to. At this point, I'm just going to hi-ho silver all my pump here, treat it as burn, and basically just fish. I put him down to 6, which is essentially 1. He factor fictions on his main. I give him a Brainstorm versus a ton of mana. He's already set on mana, so he just takes the Brainstorm, plays on a defense grid, does nothing. Plays a Voltaic Key. It could be a Vault deck as well. I don't ever really end up knowing exactly what Stefan's up to here because he doesn't really get to do that much. I just kill him. If he were to play the Vault here, the Harsh Venture would kill him if he used Vault once. It'd actually do 2 damage off the Vault and then 2 damage off of the Time Vault. With him at 1, that would put him to negative 3. So he is quite dead. Anyways, on to game number 2. That was a fast and furious game number 1. Or we didn't really have much of a game. But oftentimes, like these combo matchups, when you're playing aggro versus combo, you're not going to tend to have great games. One side will generally win resoundingly, or the aggressive deck will get to a point where your opponent's at 1 to 4 life, and all you need is one more attack step, and they manage to go off that turn. The one plus side to having a deck like, Naya Blitz and Taxes or Death and Taxes is that a lot of your cards can just buy you extra turns randomly. And then that extra 1 to 5 life that they have that requires an extra attack step is kind of irrelevant. You just attack them and kill them through it because a lot of your cards stop what they're trying to do. In this case, I'm pretty comfortable with Harsh Venture. If anything that they're trying to do has activated abilities, they're probably going to die to it. If all they have is a bunch of mana in hand or card selection that needs blue mana, probably going to die. And indeed, they do just die. So, pause, guys. Be right back momentarily for game number 2 against Stefan here on his artifact-based blue combo deck. Alrighty, guys, back for game number 2 against Stefan. Hand's acceptable. It has 2 mana sources. It is on the draw, so it's going to mitigate some of the risk of, not risk, but the card loss of Chromox. And in this game, I'm trying to honestly just fish as fast as I can. I get rid of the Dryad Militant to get a blue or green-white Mox. Cast Ransack the Lab, ditching a Teleria West and Preordain. Get out. So this hand's interesting. I actually should go over this keep. Another strong thing on this keep. So there's an interesting decision I make on this keep. This is a hand that can produce 2 mana on the first turn. The most important card, I believe, singularly in my hand is Spirit of the Labyrinth. Does not combo well with Smuggler's Copter, but I think it's the most important card in this matchup. Because of the fact that he's playing a bunch of mana ramp, the likelihood that he's playing cards like Windfall, like Time Spiral, like Time Twister, like Wheel of Fortune, is a lot higher. And those cards are obviously mitigated to an extremely high extent by a card like Spirit of the Labyrinth. But the simple fact of the matter remains, I think I made the right play here. I think it was correct to play both 1-drops before playing my first 2-drop. One, I'm able to essentially get 5 power attacking on turn 2 by doing it, by casting the Spirit of Labyrinth on turn 2. And I'm also presenting the highest volume of cards, such that if he does cast a draw 7 on his follow-up turn, I've already committed 4 of my 8 resources to the board, and I think in general that's going to benefit me more. It also decreases the time that he has to draw relevant cards. So while I do think Spirit of the Labyrinth is a more relevant disruptive effect and probably the most singularly important card in my hand, I think that it's important that I maximize the volume of cards that I put down and increase my clock on turn 1, as opposed to playing my best piece of disruption. Because the primary game plan of this deck is to beat my opponent, in this case Stefan JJ, to death. Just beat him to fucking death. And I think if I play Spirit of the Labyrinth, I'm essentially giving him an extra turn to have a draw step, as opposed to just putting 5 power down on turn 1. And now it's 4 power on turn 1, but by the time I'm casting the Spirit before the attack step on turn 2, which is where we're at in the game right now, I'm attacking for 5 at that point. Drawn to a Collision Colossus, which is basically a blank card, because I do not have access to red mana. It was kind of funny when I was playing Stefan in this game. He thought I was just on RG Aggro Pier from the first game. I believe I did show him some white mana sources, but that's not uncommon in that deck, because you can see Tribal Flames get played in that deck, etc. Whereas in this build, I'm playing actual white creatures. He didn't know that, so some of these taxi effects kind of, I think, came as a shock to him in this game. Smack him down to 13, tell him to go. He plays on another Signet, has 1 card in hand. Don't know what it is. Attack for a bunch here, I believe over half. Down to 5. Flip the Kythian. Make the Spirit indestructible. Play out the Loam Lion. Play out the Smuggler's Copter. I think this is a play error on my part. I think I should have left the Loam Lion in hand. Cast out the Smuggler's Copter and left Loam Lion in hand. Now, if he finds like a Toxic Deluge, he can wipe my board, but he goes down to 2. I guess he'd have to find Damnation specifically. Toxic Deluge wouldn't do it. So the reason that I think you want to keep the Loam Lion in hand is if he does play Damnation here, it means that I'm in a forced position to have to draw another creature card to activate the Smuggler's Copter and attack with my Kythian, or my Gideon Battleforge. If he's able to stay at 5, basically he can't fetch, and he has to stay at 5. But if he does that, like basically if he uses Lotus Petal, 2 colorless off of 2 of the Signets, plus the black mana off of the Darkslick Shores, he could Damnation my board. I guess that wouldn't work because I have Indestructible on the Spirit Labyrinth. I guess it was fine to cast out Loam Lion. Maybe I'm overthinking it. I think in some ways it was probably smarter to save Loam Lion just in case he is able to board wipe in some way. And I'm put into a 4 spot where I need to draw a card. Because if he stays at 5, the Gideon only does 4 and puts him down to 1. Turns off his fetch land, however. He tainted packs, I believe, for Tinker, but then realizes that he has nothing in his deck that he can get that's of value here with the Tinker. And exiles a large percentage of his deck. And promptly concedes as he prepares to pass it back to me and realizes he has no Tinker targets left that are worth a damn. So anyways, guys, that is game number 2 against Stefan on Academy/Workshop-based Tinker deck. I don't really know exactly what his deck is up to. I think he said it was some sort of combo with Skyship Weatherlight, which is powerful, but it's very slow and kind of clunky. But you see he's got a lot of card draw, a lot of artifact mana, a lot of ramp in here to kind of get that going. The deck looks powerful. My guess would be it probably also has a TV, a Time Vault in it, but I could be mistaken on that. You know, hard to kind of tell through the cards that he exiled. It's obviously a combo deck. You get Diabolic Vision. You know, got a lot of combo kind of cards going in here, plus a bunch of fast mana. Yeah, there's your Memory Jar. Didn't really see a lot of draw 7s. He's obviously not playing. He does not look like he's playing red at all in this deck. But when I see Voltaic Key, I tend to think that he probably has access to, you know, a Time Vault somewhere in there, and then he's using cards like, you know, Transmute, Fabricate, Reshape, Tinker, which is currently in hand. It doesn't show in the revealed zone here, but he does have Tinker in hand. That's what he found with the Tainted Pact to kind of get after just TV locking folks out on this essentially blue-black, very artifact-heavy Vault deck that I believe also has combo outs to Skyship Weatherlight. So guys, that is game number 3 that I'm going to be showcasing. I'm going to do one more game, and then it sounds like I'm probably going to be generating some other content with a sister channel, with Cardboard Confrontations, Jordan, relatively soon. So I'm going to cut this video a little bit short and just do one more game that I actually played in League. You know, if this is a deck that you would like to see more of, I can put up more gameplay of it if that's desired. But go ahead and let me know in the comments section, because I'm only going to do one more game here. Quick pause, guys. We'll be back with game number 4 and the closing game in this VOD. Alrighty, folks, we're back. Playing against Wolfgang Cloud. Tends to play red deck wins, but basically any aggro strat, I'll put them on. This hand's not great against that, but I don't want to like just blind mull into like a hand that's good against like what I assume this opponent's on. I kind of want to have a good game. This hand's still acceptable, though. So the one nice thing about this hand is if my opponent does exactly this, I can just blow them out. I go ahead and abrade this Figure of Destiny, eating up essentially 5 of their mana for 2 of my mana and a card plus 1 of their cards. Pretty good exchange rate. Play on a basic here because I want to play around back to basics as much as possible. Get the Legion War Boss out, swing for 1. Essentially get a 2 for 1 here because I get to keep a 1/1 Gabo. And they're likely going to kill this. They kill it with Searing Blow, which is a good way to kill it. Do 6 to me on this turn. Play on Experiment 1. Cast out the Deathrite Shaman. And unfortunately, my mana has worked out in a way that I don't have the ability to cast Rancor this turn and start getting more damage in. I cast an Earthshaker Keenra. It's possible I should have blocked this here with the Deathrite, but I don't do so. I have the idea that I'm probably going to be gaining life with it, but then another opportunity comes along, which is Aven Mind Sensor, and I want to leave that up, I think, over gaining life, but I'll at least leave the Deathrite back. Now, I think here, I guess if I want to play specifically around Black Lotus, I shouldn't have blocked. But I think blocking here against the Earthshaker Kenra is more correct to not be at 10. Because I didn't, when I see the Rampaging Ferocity, I definitely do not commit to... I can take 1 damage after casting the Aven Mind. I commit to basically still developing my board to do more damage. I casted a Tarkus Command to boost my creatures and do 3 damage. They have a removal spell, which is not a huge shock. They dome me down to 6. I get the Rancor back. I don't like their block here. I think their block's really greedy. I think it's overly greedy. And they come to admit, like, they did draw the Thunderbolt this turn, so they didn't per se have the kill in hand. I don't like blocking the Deathrite Shaman. I think what they did, because we talked about the game afterwards, is they blocked it, forgetting that the Rampaging Ferocidon stopped me from gaining life. So the Deathrite Shaman was definitely not the right block there. If I had any shock or any sort of pump spell, they just lose the game here on the spot, basically. I do not at this point, and they drew into what they needed to actually kill me, which at this point was the Thunderbolt, plus the attack step from the Rampaging Ferocidon. I obviously don't cast out the Tarmogoyf. It makes no sense to do so. They're dead to either one of my threats if they do not block, well, and they're dead to Rancor as well, and the Tarmogoyf puts me down to 5 because of the Rampaging Ferocidon's ability doing 1 damage to me. I'm not going to be able to block a Menace 3/3, which means I'll then go to 2, and then any shot kills me. So basically, I did play it out because I wanted to force them to actually have a 3 damage 2 to 3 mana burn spell, and they ended up drawing it and having it here, so I go down to 0 and I die. I could have played more conservatively and not done an all-out attack, but basically I assumed that I wanted to put them into a spot where they had to use their burn to do a lesser amount of damage to me to remove my threats, which I think is the proper way to play it. As it played out, Black Lotus was still relevant on that turn, and it was able to allow them to cast a lot more spells for a decent rate. But either way, I think we played this as correctly as we could. I do think, given slightly different draws, like i.e. not drawing our 4th land, or drawing a burn or pump spell over a Tarmogoyf, put us in the winning spot in this matchup. I think we played it decently well. Anyways, guys, quick pause. We'll be back for game number 2 in this match set. Alrighty, guys, we're back. Hand looks great. It's got Giver of Runes, which is basically a must-remove on turn 1. It also has Forked Bolt to deal with generally up to 2 threats out of this deck specifically. Opponent plays out a Vexing Devil. I just take the damage. It's a lot of damage, but I think it's worth doing here. I'm going to develop with the Fleecemane Lion. Because I don't have a high instant count, I don't think it's worth casting out, the Tattermunch plus the Skull Clamp. I'd rather just get a big 3/3 down that can start actually attacking again pretty well. Opponent plays 2 1-drop threats here, one of which is Fire Drink Satyr, which means I'm even going to get some value off Forked Bolt. Forked Bolt will basically become Arc Lightning. I go ahead and cast my Arc Lightning for quote-unquote, lack of better terms. Cast out the Dryad Militant is another pretty useful, attacker. And smack in there for 3, getting them into 15. Now to 13, my opponent's a little bit ahead on cards, definitely ahead on mana, but I have a much more developed board at this point. I go ahead and just swing in. They opt not to block. I go ahead and just sack the Horizon Canopy here. I want to kind of play around, 1, I want to develop my graveyard, and 2, I kind of want to play around Price of Progress as much as possible. I make a play error here. I totally forget that Dryad Militant's going to exile my Lightning Bolt. What I want to do here is exile or have the bolt go to the yard, and then fetch, and then actually cast out, which will put 4 things in my yard, plus the 2 mana I have available, which is 6. I want to use Become Immense on a threat they did not block with their Chandra to actually win the game. But I'm a dummy, and I forget that Dryad Militant exiles my own Lightning Bolt, so I'm like, oh, that was stupid. They get a block here, I lose a creature card. It's going to make it a little easier to cast my Become Immense on the following turn. They cast out a Seasoned Pyromancer and I believe a Rakdos Cackler, realize that they have a high creature count, low burn count hand, and are unable to seal it up because I'll just protect one of my things from red while they're tapped out, basically forcing them to utilize a Fire Blast in response to the Giver of Runes trigger, which means that I will use Become Immense in response to a Fire Blast or a free burn spell to pump the Fleecemane Lion beyond killability with the 4 damage burn spell like Fire Blast, and it'll have protection from red after it survives the Fire Blast with 4 damage on it as a 9/9 protection from red, which will attack through all of their blockers and kill them. So they go ahead and pack it in here. That is game number 2, guys. Quick pause. We'll be back momentarily for game number 3. Alrighty, guys, we're back. That's kind of one of the benefits you'll see in this matchup is that, I just have bigger creatures than Red Deck Wins does, and my creature, I have Tarmogoyfs and stuff like that. They're just big, and I have, Curd Apes, which is just a big guy for 1 mana. I have to play this kind of differently than I would in a lot of other matchups. In a lot of other matchups, well, 1, they're not going to have a ton of 1-drop 2/1s. And I would just develop my Curd Ape on turn 1. But what I have to do is actually just remove the Zergo Bellstriker early because I don't think Chain Lightning is going to scale all that well. They cast out an Orcish Hellraiser, which is a 3/2 with Echo 1, that when it dies, it does 2 damage to a Planeswalker or a player, which is going to be me. I use my Lightning Bolt on it because I just want to get it off the board. I could have traded the Curd Ape, but I think it's better to have a board development as opposed to, it's better to have the board development stay on the board as opposed to retaining burn spells in my hand. I go ahead and equip up the Curd Ape with both Rancor and Skull Clamp. This does, of note, put it down to 2 toughness, which means a shot can kill it. But if they opt to kill it here, which they do with Firebolt, then I'm going to get 2 cards. I'm going to get the Rancor back, which should be okay with. Draw to a Goyf, which Goyf is a big lad. I kind of want to hit a basic here, but this is still fine. I develop out the Tarmogoyf plus the Grim Lavamancer, which is going to deal with this Figure of Destiny very nicely. End up playing out the Rancor and leave up 1 mana for the Grim Lavamancer to kill the Figure of Destiny in response to activation. I go ahead and do that, killing the figure. The reason I don't opt, I consider briefly going to face here, but I don't, because I don't need to. I have Berserk, which is going to make the Tarmogoyf so massive there's no way they could possibly beat it. Blocking with Mother Runes may seem interesting, but there are ways they kill me here with Price of Progress or Fire Blast if I do not block. So I opt to give up my Giver of Runes to block because I just want to be careful. I have the win next turn. It's not worth exposing myself to lethal damage in some way, shape, or form. The fact they did not attack with the Mishra's Factory tells me that their mana is really relevant to what they're trying to do. So because they didn't do that, I actually just opt to block there. Now, a more standard attack out of them would be like Mishra's Factory plus the Monastery Swift Spear. In which case, I'd still block the Monastery Swift Spear because it has a much higher chance of getting larger than the Mishra's Factory does and taking 2. But then I have, I just think all around you really want to play around their routes, which at this point would be Pop. Pop would do 9 plus 1 on Monastery Swift Spear. I guess it doesn't quite do it because they can't cast that plus cast the Firebolt post combat. Although, I guess it's not entirely true. I didn't know they had Searing Blaze at the beginning of that combat step. What they could have done is Fire Blast plus Firebolt. They have to do Firebolt main 1, knocking out the Giver of Runes, putting the Monastery Swift Spear to a 2/3, putting me... I'd still beat the same life total, 2/3, plus 4 damage off sacking both mountains to Fire Blast, 4 damage down to 5, Monastery Swift Spear to a 3/4, putting me to 2. They'd be a mana short, I think, of activating Mishra's Factory to put me to dead. So either way, very, very close game. I think the block there was correct with Giver of Runes. I'm trying to construct in my mind how they could have killed me, having not known they had Searing Blaze as one of the 2 cards they had in their hand. Knowing that they had Searing Blaze, 1 card I don't think does it here. I think it takes 2. To get me from this position because Firebolt's not efficient enough and Fire Blast does not do enough raw damage. What I have to do here is play the Kasali Pride Mage to buff the Tarmogoyf to a 7/6. 6 is almost impossible for them to deal with. The big reason I didn't equip the Skull Clamp is because if they have like a 4 damage burn spell like Char, I don't want to just have the Tarmogoyf get removed in combat and not kill them this turn and give them a full extra turn to actually try to kill me. So I kind of like the way I play this. I play the Kasali Pride Mage out first. It means it's basically impossible for them to block with Mishra's Factory. It means that I get 1 extra toughness on the Tarmogoyf, which means that it's going to require basically 2 cards, of which they only have 1 in hand, to remove it. And that's 14 damage coming at them with a Berserk on it. So they go ahead and die here. So anyways, guys, I'm going to go ahead and conclude it here. As you can see, this Naya Blitz and Taxes deck, I think has a fairly decent aggressive matchup percentage. It tends to have a slightly increased, I think, capability to kill combination-style decks. Retains its qualities of the RG qualities of being good versus control, albeit a bit slower. And then where it tends to probably have its most challenging matchups is one that we didn't see as much of, which is mid-range. I think like Abzan mid-range or like Jeskai mid-range will tend to be a little more challenging for it. One of the ways you can kind of I think get after that is by playing more double white cards. Like, if you started putting in Core Firewalkers and Silver Knights, you tend to get better against those style of decks. But anyways, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed the content, and if you are interested in seeing more gameplay of Naya Blitz and Taxes, then, let me know, and I will possibly explore that more. As far as next steps and videos go, I intend on making a VOD relatively soon that encompasses my current build of Mono White Death and Taxes. It's a list that, up until recently, I believe I went 4-0 3 times in League with it, or maybe it was 2 times 3-0 in League, or I'm sorry, 4-0 in League with it. So it's on quite a winning spree with Mono White Death and Taxes against a wide variety of decks as well. And that's kind of what inspired this build is, I kind of wanted to take some of the the chippy, disruptive, interactive cards out of mono white Death and Taxes, and include them in a more aggressive shell like RG Blitz. And I think the marrying up of the two strategies has worked out decently well to this point. It's still a little early to kind of tell what overall match percentages the deck has against everything, and I don't even know if you really ever fully get that in Canadian Highlander because it's such an underplayed format. Very select few folks playing it, and frankly, not to sound conceited, but the skill level of pilots is pretty vastly different in the format as well. So it's kind of hard to tell if like you're winning matchups that you shouldn't be winning based on build decisions and based on play decisions. It takes a lot of numbers, I think, to really get that. But I do think this deck does strategically attack the format singularly in a different way than both Death and Taxes and RG Aggro. It kind of gives it an edge, and I think, it's almost a disservice to call it Naya Blitz, because I've seen the Naya Blitz list, and they're more just aggressive decks that play 3 colors. I think in general, they tend to be a little bit worse than like just the RG Blitz or Aggro list, because they have more color requirements. But I do think this list does gain some edges on both strategies while straddle building both of them with the highest impact cards to, one, augment the general aggressive strategy through board impacting taxi cards, and then through the high impact or poor matchup decks that are poor matchups this deck may have. It augments it with stuff like Spirit of the Labyrinth, where hey, you're not going to draw 7 cards out of nowhere against me. Draw 0 and I'll draw 1. We'll both discard our hand or whatever. So anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed it, and take care now.